going to speak about the 1948 war, which changed the Middle East geopolitically and resulted in the creation of a Palestinian refugee problem, which is still with us and is a major obstacle for any potential Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. These are perhaps the two main results: the creation of Israel, which changed the geopolitics, and the creation of the refugee problem. I spent about 30 years studying the conflict, Israeli history and the conflict with the Arabs from the 1980s until 2010, more or less. Then I switched to the subject of Turkey. But in 2008, I published a history of the 48 war, and what I'm really going to be telling you here are some of the conclusions of that study. The war was the culmination, the 1948 war was the culmination of more or less 60 years of conflict between the native inhabitants of Palestine, the Arabs who lived in Palestine, who eventually would be called Palestinians, and the incoming Jewish settlers who were Zionists. The Arab propaganda often points to 1917 as the beginning of the conflict between the Zionists and the Palestinians. And this is in order to link it to the Balfour Declaration and therefore link it to British imperialism, in fact, thus designating Zionism as well a form or a child of imperialism. I think this is wrong, historically wrong. The conflict begins actually in the 1880s when the Zionist settlers begin to arrive in Palestine. We already have small clashes between some of the local inhabitants around Petah Tikva, Rehovot in the 1880s. 1917, with the Balfour Declaration, the British conquest of Palestine, is of course a milestone, but it's not the origin of the conflict. Over the decades after the arrival of the first Zionists, Arab resistance grew to this influx of strangers. There were bouts of violence in 1920, 21, 29, 36, 39 by the Palestinian Arabs against the Zionists, and these bouts of violence reached their crescendo and culminated in the 48 war. The 48 war began a day after the United Nations General Assembly passed the Partition Resolution 29th of November 47, which proposed partitioning Palestine, the area which Britain had administered for the previous 30 years, into two states, one Jewish, one Arab. The Zionists, the Jewish agency which represented the Jewish community in Palestine, accepted the partition resolution. The Arab world rejected it, as did the Palestinian Arab leadership, and the next day a Palestinian gunman began to shoot in uncoordinated fashion, shoot at Jewish civilians, transport on the roads, and gradually this sporadic shooting turned into a full-scale civil war. The 1948 war was unique, maybe even in history, modern history, in that it combined two separate parts, two distinct separate parts. The first part was a civil war between the Jewish community in Palestine and the Arab community in Palestine, lasting from November 47 until mid-May 1948. While the British still ruled officially, formally, they still ruled Palestine, and the two communities living there were busy shooting at each other. The second part of the war was a conventional war between states. Israel was declared on the 14th of May, 1948. On the 15th of May, Arab armies invaded Palestine, some of them attacking the State of Israel. I'll go into this later. And this began a war between the newborn State of Israel and the Arab states, neighboring Arab states. And this war lasted basically until January 1949, when the hostilities ended, essentially with Jewish victory. And formal armistice agreements were signed between Israel and its neighbors, its four neighbors, during the following months, the last one being signed between Israel and Syria in July 1949. That was the official end, but hostilities had ended in January 1949. Both bouts, it's worth mentioning, because Arab propaganda sort of blurs this, both bouts of the war, the civil war and the conventional war, were launched by the Arabs, Palestinian Arabs shooting at Jews, Arab states attacking the newborn State of Israel. As the Arabs, of course, see it, I maybe should add this, they see the whole Zionist influx from the 1880s until the present day into Palestine as an invasion. So they see the war, even though they started shooting, as defensive, as against Zionist aggression, which was this influx, which they regard as a Zionist invasion. Now, among the conclusions I reached in the book, which, as I say, is in a sense the conclusion of 30 years of study of the war and the conflict more generally, I want to speak about 3 or 4 subjects. One is the nature of the war. Conventional wisdom has it that the 1948 war was a war between two national groups, a nationalist war, if you like, a political war over territory. Now, it's true that it was a war over territory, but also sort of unique in modern history. From the Arab perspective, the war was over the whole of Palestine. National wars between states or national groups are usually about borderlands. Between France and Germany over the 19th, 20th centuries, there were a series of wars. It was about Alsace-Lorraine, among other things. But it wasn't the Germans wanted to take over and turn France into part of Germany. And, of course, the French didn't want to turn Germany into part of France. They fought about borderlands. In this war, the Arab side wanted all of Palestine. In 1948, I think it's more or less true in some way to this very day. So it's a war about the whole of the country. So though, as I say, a nationalist, a political struggle, territorial struggle. What I want to add to that, though, and that's the conventional wisdom, that it was a national political war, is that it was also a religious war. Certainly from the Arab side, it was fought partly as a religious war. There was a large element of religion, if you like, jihadism, in the Arab assault on the Jewish state by the Palestinians and subsequently by the Arab states. And this contention of mine that the war had this dual nature is somewhat controversial. There are historians who don't accept this. They reject the fact that the proposition that the war was also fought from the Arab side as a holy war, as a jihadist enterprise. But let me give you 1 or 2 proofs, if you like, to back what I'm saying, to back my contention. On the 1st of December, 1947, 3 days after the Partition resolution, the ulama of Al-Azhar University, the ulama being the Council of Theologians of Al-Azhar University, which is the oldest university in the Arab world, and is also the most important authority in interpreting the Quran in the Sunni Arab world, which is the majority religion in the Muslim world. The ulama of Al-Azhar issued a fatwa, a religious ruling, declaring that jihad was necessary, calling for jihad against the Zionist enterprise to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. This is on the 1st of December, calling on all Muslims basically in the world, not just in the Arab world, to rise up and either join the jihad and fight or contribute what they could to the battle against Zionism. This fatwa was reissued by the ulama of Al-Azhar in April 1948 on the eve of the pan-Arab invasion of mid-May 1948. In other words, they were saying to the Arab rulers in this renewed fatwa, you must attack Palestine. The Arab leaders were not sure they were actually going to invade, even though they kept declaring they would. But this was to reinforce their resolution to actually invade and to say they have the God behind them. Allah backs you. Allah says it's an imperative of the religion, of the dogma, to attack the Jewish state, April 48. And they actually reissued the fatwa a third time in December 1948, by which time the Arabs had already lost the war. Israel had defeated the Egyptian army, had blocked the other armies, and the Arabs had lost the war. And by reissuing the fatwa, they were basically saying, well, we may have lost the first round, but there will be further rounds, and we are encouraging you, we're giving you the religious imprimatur to continue the battle when you're ready again. Is the air here dry? Is that what it is? It's very, okay. There was a woman called Matiel Muranam, who was a Christian Lebanese woman. I think she came from Beirut. Married a Palestinian Arab in East Jerusalem, moved to East Jerusalem when she married him. And she was the head of a very small women's organization called the Palestine Women's Organization, which was the women's affiliate of the Arab Higher Committee. The Arab Higher Committee was the leadership group of the Palestinian National Movement headed by Haj Amin al-Husseini. The Arab Higher Committee had this woman's affiliate, and the woman who headed it was this woman, Matiel Muranam, a Christian from Lebanon. And she said the following in January 1948 in an interview. The UN decision has united all Arabs as they have never been united before, not even against the Crusaders. A Jewish state has no chance to survive now that the Holy War has been declared. All the Jews will eventually be massacred. Why is this important? Or it's good as an illustration for the atmosphere which I say did exist in Palestine and in the Arab world around with the UN decision and the beginning of the war. She accepted without argument that they were involved, the Arabs were engaged in holy war, this Christian woman. I'll just add one other small item to support this contention that the war was also a religious war from the Arab perspective. That is King Abdullah of Jordan, who was probably the most moderate of the Arab leaders, had secret negotiations with the Jews about some sort of a mutually accepted agreement about the future of Palestine. I'll talk about that in a second. He came to the Jordan Valley on the 14th of May to send off his troops to cross the Jordan River and invade Palestine the next day. And he gave them a speech. And he said there, some of you will make it and cross the river and win the war, and you will be able to tell your grandchildren about this glorious adventure. And some of you will become martyrs, shuhada. In other words, he was using religious terminology also with respect to this war from the Arab perspective. It's worth mentioning that from the Jewish side, the war was not a holy war in any sense. The Jewish community in Palestine was led by secularists, people who had rebelled against religion, Ben-Gurion and so on. The cabinet was basically stacked with secular labor rights. The security services, the defense forces were led by Mapayniks, by secular, mostly laborite Jews. They didn't think of it in terms of holy war. Didn't come into it. The religious population in Palestine at the time of the Yishuv, the religious minority, if you like, in the Jewish community, was less than 1% Haredim. Today in Israel, it's 12% Haredim among the Jews. Then it was less than 1%, and religious people in general were a little more, another 5 or 6 or 7% at the time. They had no real power, no real political significance, and therefore, when the Yishuv went to war, the Jewish community in Palestine went to war, it was simply a secular war. Now, what were the war aims of the two sides? Or it's actually more than two sides, because we're talking about the Jews, the Jewish community in Palestine, which transforms into the State of Israel on the 14th of May on the one hand. And on the other hand, you've got the Palestinian Arabs and then a number of different Arab states who participate in the war. Well, in the Jewish side, I believe there were three war aims. The primary first one, the overwhelming one, if you like, was survival. The Jewish community in Palestine wanted to survive the onslaught by the Palestinian Arab militias, which had begun on the 30th of November. And they wanted to survive the onslaught with their newborn state of the Jewish state from the 15th of May onwards. This was the primary aim of the Jewish side in the war. To this accrued two additional war aims, one of which is more or less accepted by most historians, and the other which is controversial. Some historians reject it. The second war aim, beyond survival, weathering the storm, was expansion. The Jewish leaders, the Zionist leaders, from March, April 48, wanted to expand the territory of the prospective Jewish state beyond the borders earmarked by the United Nations Partition Resolution. The Partition Resolution had given the Jews, or earmarked for the Jews, 55% of Palestine's landmass. Palestine was about 10,000 square miles. Close to 6,000 square miles were allocated by the Partition Resolution for Jewish statehood. The Yishuv's leaders from March, April 48 decided to expand the territory, to give it better borders, more defensible borders, perhaps to have a little more territory on which to settle Jewish immigrants who were expected to come in large numbers after the state was created, after the war. And the fact is that the war ended with the Jews in occupation of 8,000 square miles of Palestine. In other words, adding 2,000 square miles to those allotted for Jewish statehood by the Partition Resolution. It's also worth noting, it didn't take the whole 100% of Palestine, the whole 10,000 square miles, which it could have done. Israel was much stronger at the end of the war than all the Arab states combined. We're talking basically about the West Bank. One of the generals, one of the important generals in the war, a man called Yigal Allon, commander of Southern Front, in March 1949, wrote Ben-Gurion a letter saying, "Give me 3 days, I'll take the West Bank," which was under Jordanian occupation at the end of the war. And Ben-Gurion said no, because the Jordanians had a mutual defense pact with the British. He didn't explain, but I'm thinking, getting into his head, they had a mutual defense pact with Britain. Perhaps Britain would be sucked into the war if Israel conquered the West Bank. The West Bank was full of Arabs, local Arabs, and refugees who had left the Israeli areas and settled temporarily in the West Bank. Adding these Arabs would vastly increase the number of Arabs in the states. In the new state, Ben-Gurion didn't want that. So he said no to Allon, and the West Bank remained in Jordanian hands at the end of the war. The third war aim of the Zionist side, and this one, as I said, is controversial, there are people who reject this, was to reduce the number of Arabs who would remain in the Jewish state at the end of the war. If you like, expulsion. They wanted as few Arabs as possible. Why did they want as few Arabs as possible? Because they wanted to create a Jewish majority state. The Arabs had just essentially rebelled against the UN Partition Resolution and fought against the Yishuv, bringing them back, allowing refugees back and so on, or not expelling some, it would leave a large Arab minority which would be necessarily disloyal, necessarily rebellious against the Jewish state. Better as few as possible. Also in the long term, in terms of demographics, not just security, the less Arabs, the more Jewish, the stronger the Jewish state would be. This is what underlay the desire by Ben-Gurion and others to reduce the number of Arabs in the Jewish state. There was I would say from April 1948 on, there was an atmosphere of transfer in the country. There is a lot of officers in the Haganah, which became the IDF. A lot of officials in the Jewish state's administration wanted to see the backs of the Arabs, and they were given their head in some way by Ben-Gurion, though others, some officers said no, didn't want to expel Arabs. Arabs were left in place in various areas, which is why the war ended in 1949 with 700,000 Jews in the Jewish state and 150,000 Arabs. In other words, there was no blanket order or policy to expel the Arabs. Otherwise, they wouldn't have left a fifth of the population Arab in the new state. But that's how it ended. A fifth of the population was Arab in the new state, but there were, of course, a large number of Palestinians uprooted in the course of the war, and I'll get to that in a second. The Arab states, or the Arab side in the war, is much more difficult to accurately summarize. What did they want by going to war? What did the Palestinian leadership want when it basically unleashed this snowballing civil war? And what did the Arab states want when they attacked the Jewish state, or at least invaded the territory of mandatory Palestine? Well, the problem is that they did not leave, or did not give us, or did not open their documentation, their archives. The Egyptians, the Syrians, the Iraqis, the Jordanians may have good archives in their capitals, but nobody sees them, nobody has seen them. They're not open to researchers, not Arabs and not Jews. So we don't know what the cabinet in Cairo discussed, what the resolution of the cabinet was in Cairo when they went to war on the 15th of May, what the cabinet and the king, Farouk, told the generals is our war aim. Should you conquer Tel Aviv? Do you conquer the whole of the Jewish state? Do you actually drive the Jews into the sea? We don't know if that was their policy, because we don't have the minutes, the protocols of the cabinet meetings, things which we do have on the Jewish side. On the Jewish side, the archives are enormous, they're very rich. And you have everybody writing, everybody feels he's participating in a major moment in history, and every sergeant is writing reports, every lieutenant, every major. The place is flooded with reports, and including cabinet protocols and so on. On the Arab side, this is all closed. So how do you know what the Arab intentions were? Well, first, what their war aims were. Well, you know that the Palestinians unleashed a sort of guerrilla terrorist war against the Jews in Palestine during that civil war. And probably the aim of it was to cause sufficient anarchy that the Jewish state would not emerge and be declared on the 15th of May. The anarchy would cause perhaps the United Nations to send in troops or to come and intervene, the Americans to intervene. It would perhaps prevent the emergence of a Jewish state if the place was in a bloodbath, basically. Did the Palestinians want to throw the Jews into the sea, as the phrase went later on? Well, we don't know, because they never said that. Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Palestinian leaders, never used that type of phrase where want to destroy the Jewish state, or the emergent Jewish state. Neither did the Arab leaders from the outside. They never actually said, we are invading the country to destroy the Jewish state or to throw the Jews into the sea. Later, Israeli propaganda would say that was the Arab intention. Well, it could be that had they conquered Tel Aviv and Haifa, the Arab states and the whole of the Jewish concentrations of population, maybe there would have been giant massacres and many Jews would have been thrown into the sea. But this isn't what they stated as their intention. The Egyptian government, for example, on the 15th of May, as their army crossed the border in the south into Palestine, did declare that they're entering the country, they're invading the country in order to save their Palestinian brothers. Their Palestinian brothers who basically just lost the civil war. The civil war had ended in the middle of May with basically with a complete defeat of the Palestinian side and with a large number of Palestinians already uprooted from their homes. And there were Jewish atrocities which helped in this process of uprooting the Palestinians. So the Egyptians declared, we're coming to save the Palestinians. Now, Of course, it's politic to say we're coming to save somebody, not we're coming to destroy somebody. It sounds better internationally. So one could expect that they would say this. But we don't know whether they intended more than that. What we do know is that the Arab armies, some of them invaded, attacked the area of the Jewish state as allotted by the United Nations Partition Resolution. And here we're talking about the Egyptian, the Syrian, and the Iraqi armies. All three crossed into territory which had been earmarked for Jewish statehood. Whether they intended, as I say, to go to Tel Aviv to conquer the whole of the Jewish state area in prospect, we don't know. We also know that these armies were all stopped by the Haganah. It blocked them, it stopped them. Maybe if it had been easy, they would have gone to Tel Aviv and Haifa. But it wasn't easy. They weren't able to break the Haganah lines, break through. They were essentially contained. So we don't know what their real intentions were. They say the Syrians perhaps wanted to conquer the area of the Sea of Galilee, all the shores. You know, they had one shore, they wanted all the rest of it. Maybe, but we don't know. All we can say for sure is that 3 of the Arab armies did attack the area of the Jewish state, certainly to take chunks of the Jewish state for themselves, to annex, if you like, chunks of the area allotted for Jewish statehood. The Jordanian army, which incidentally was the best of the Arab armies in the 48 war, I would go so far as to say the best of the armies participating in the 48 war, never attacked the Jewish state in any part of its territory as allotted by the United Nations. Didn't attack the Jewish state. It did go to East Jerusalem. It occupied the West Bank, went to East Jerusalem, which had been earmarked for international control. Jerusalem was not given to the Jews or the Arabs in the UN Partition Resolution. It was supposed to be an international zone. And the Jordanians wanted East Jerusalem. So they went to East Jerusalem. This caused battles with the Jews in West Jerusalem, along the road to Jerusalem. But they never actually attacked the Jewish state. The Jordanian army, which, as I say, was the best of the Arab armies. And the war ended with the Jordanians in occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and Israel, where it is up to 1967. In other words, they basically partitioned the country between them, even though they hadn't reached a finalized agreement about partition. Before the war, let me add one more sentence about this. Before the war in 46, 47, Jewish agency representatives and King Abdullah of Transjordan, of Jordan, had negotiated some sort of deal secretly to partition the country between the Jordanians and the Jews, not to allow the Palestinians a state. The Jordanians would get the West Bank, more or less. The Jews would get the territory which later the United Nations in 47 had allocated for them, and that would be the partition. Jordan and the Jews partitioning the country, the Arabs of Palestine getting no part of it. This was more or less a deal reached by the end of 47. It's not clear whether both sides abided by it or accepted it as a finalized deal. But as I say, the war nonetheless ended in this partition, in exactly this partition. So perhaps both sides understood this is what should be done. And this, as I say, the Jordanian war aim was essentially to take over the core areas allotted for Palestinian Arab statehood, the West Bank, not to attack the state of Israel or destroy it. In Israeli textbooks, incidentally, Israeli school textbooks, it usually says 5 Arab armies invaded Palestine, or it attacked the state of Israel. Well, actually, the 5th Arab state, Lebanon, never actually, its army, which was composed altogether of 3 battalions, never actually crossed the border. The Israelis and Lebanese did fight a little bit, but that's because Israel invaded Lebanon, not because the Lebanese invaded Palestine. Most of the battles, incidentally, between the Jews, the Israeli side, and the Jordanians were fought in the areas allotted for Palestinian Arab statehood, in Latrun, Lida, and Ramla, and so on. As I say, not in Israeli territory, because the Jordanians never crossed into it. After the war, the Israelis and Jordanians resumed their secret negotiations. They never actually reached a deal. There was never a peace treaty agreed. And Abdullah in 1951 was assassinated by a Palestinian gunman, and that was the end of that, except that in 1995, Israel and Jordan did sign a peace agreement with Abdullah's grandson, King Hussein, which in a sense was a continuation of Abdullah's policy of coexistence with the Jews in Palestine. A third subject which is dealt with in my book 1948 and in its conclusions is the refugee problems generated by the 1948 war. And I use the word problems. We all know, of course, of the Palestinian Arab refugee problem, which emerged from the war, in which the war resulted. But actually, let me begin with the minor refugee problem created by the war, which wasn't actually that minor, and that is of Israeli refugees created by the Arab invasion, by the Palestinian attacks, and by the subsequent Arab invasion of the country. 70,000 Jews in Palestine were displaced from their homes, from their kibbutzim, from some of the towns. The Jewish community, for example, in the old city of Jerusalem, which was conquered by the Jordanian Arab Legion, they were displaced from their homes. Now, you may think 70,000 people is not much, but if the population of the country was altogether 650 to 700,000 Jews, 70,000 is 10% of the country's Jewish population, which was displaced from their homes and became refugees. In America, for example, if 10% of the population was displaced and became refugees, we're talking about 30 million refugees. So it was an enormous burden for these 700,000 while conducting a war to deal with and feed and house, etc., these 70,000 who had been ejected from their homes by Arab warfare. But that refugee problem vanished because the Jews won the war. They basically held on to or reconquered the settlements from which either the whole of the population had fled inland to Tel Aviv or whatever, or the women and children who'd been sent back to rear areas to be out of harm's way. They didn't reconquer everything. The old city of Jerusalem wasn't taken. The Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem was destroyed basically by the Jordanians. So those people had to be rehoused. But essentially, the problem of the 70,000 Jewish refugees caused by the war from among the population, the Jewish population in the country, vanished. No Jewish refugee problem at the end of the war. The second refugee problem, and you may want to talk about that, I asked questions about that, I dealt with that at length in 3 books, in fact, was the Palestinian Arab refugee problem. Approximately 700,000 Arabs were displaced, uprooted from their homes in the course of the war from 1947 to 1949, 700,000. The Arabs maintained the number was 1 million. The Jews said the number was 500,000. The UN came and checked, and with a number of committees, they reached the conclusion it was about or just over 700,000, and that's probably the right number. I'll just say 1 or 2 words about why they became refugees, but as I say, we can talk about it more. It's something which I can talk about at length if you want. Most fled the onrush of war. Jewish troops were rumored to be coming towards their village to attack it. They shelled the village, they stormed the village, they conquered the urban neighborhood, and this caused mass flight throughout the country, each Jewish offensive, especially in April, May, resulting in mass flight from the various areas. Most of the Palestinian refugees, incidentally, most of the 700,000, ended up moving from one part of Palestine to another, not out of the country. 1/3 moved out of the country to Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and 2/3 moved to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and then encamped in so-called refugee camps, which in a sense, if you look at the Oxford Dictionary, for example, a refugee is defined as somebody who has been pushed out of left because of religious or war or whatever persecution, leaves his country. The Palestinian refugees, 2/3 of them in the 48 war, did not leave their country. They only left their homes in Jaffa, in Haifa, etc., and moved to other parts of Palestine. 1/3 of them moved out of the country. And today, of course, these 700,000 have matured into something like 6 million. On the United Nations books, there are 6 million Palestinian refugees being in some way supported by their school systems, they get food handouts and so on. Something like 6 million Palestinian refugees exist on the United Nations rolls. That's a small minority who've remained alive from the original 700,000, plus their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. That's who the Palestinian refugees are. And that problem is not resolved. As you know, it's a problem which is still there on the books, on the table, growingly more difficult to solve. Israeli governments, ever since 1948, have refused to accept a mass Palestinian refugee return for the same reasons that in 48 they said no. Allowing them back would flood the country with Arabs. The Arabs would become instantly a majority. They would be subversive. They would be disloyal. The same is applied to every government, Israeli government since then. Consistent Israeli policy of all governments, labor, right, left, is that there will be no mass Palestinian refugee return for the same reasons. Some of the Palestinian Arabs, some of those 700,000 who became refugees, were expelled by Israeli troops, as famously from Lydda and Ramleh in July 12th, 13th, 1948. But a small number were also advised or ordered by their own local leaders, not Arab national leaders, but by their own leaders to leave, perhaps to prepare the way for the Arab army's invasions, perhaps to keep women and children out of harm's way. So a certain number of Palestinian Arabs were also instructed or advised by their own leaders, their communal leaders, to leave the country, leave their homes and move out to the West Bank or out of the country. So there were these three different factors in the creation of the refugee problem, but the overwhelming one is simple fear. Arabs left their homes because they were under threat or attack by Jewish forces. The third refugee problem created by the 48 war is, of course, the Jews who lived in Arab countries, the Jewish communities who lived in Yemen, Iraq, Egypt, Syria, North Africa, etc. Over the years 1948 to 1964, these communities vanished. There are no Jews left in Arab countries. There's maybe a few thousand left in Morocco. There used to be 300 to 400,000 Jews in Morocco until 1964, at least until 1956. Today there may be 2,000 to 3,000. In Iraq, which had 150,000 Jews, there may be 2 or 3 left, 2 or 3 individuals left in Baghdad. That's basically it. They vanished. The Yemeni Jews vanished. Now, what happened to them? Well, basically, most of them, the vast majority being poor, moved to Israel. They were absorbed by Israel, better or worse, in various ways. They were absorbed ultimately by Israel, given housing, given education, given jobs, and they became integrated into Israeli society. There was discrimination. There's various complaints by various people that they weren't treated properly or initially not treated properly, but they were absorbed. The upper class of Arab Jewry, in other words, those from Baghdad or Casablanca, ended up moving, of course, the richer ones ended up moving to London and Paris, basically, and the poorer ones ended up in Israel. What all this meant, and they were absorbed properly in England and English and French society. What this means is that today there is no Jewish refugee problem, Jews from Arab lands. No such refugee problem exists. Occasionally you'll hear some of their spokesmen in Israel or elsewhere saying we should be compensated because they lost in this transfer of population Jews from Arab lands, and we're talking about 700,000 to 800,000 Jews, more or less the same number as Palestinians who left Israel. They lost enormous amounts of property, especially the richer communities of Iraq and Egypt and Syria. So some people say they should be compensated. They, like the Palestinians, demand compensation. But that's where the state of play. But there is no Jewish refugee problem from Arab lands. The major difference between the two, of course, is that the Palestinian refugees want to go back to their homes, lands, etc. The houses may not exist, or they may be occupied by Jews since 48, but they want to go back. The Jews from Arab lands, of course, don't want to go back. Maybe on a visit to Morocco, but that's about it. They don't want to go back. So there's sort of an asymmetry there. But we can talk about it more if you like, why the Arabs remained refugees. I'll just say 2 or 3 words about a fourth subject which comes up often, which has a political and moral dimension, and that is the balance of forces between the two sides in the war, or between the various sides in the 48 war. Commonly, Israel portrayed itself at the time, and has been portrayed since, certainly in the West, as the David opposite the Arab Goliath. And if you look at a map, of course, The Arab states stretched from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf. They had tens of millions in population. The Arabs of Palestine outnumbered the Jews in Palestine 2 to 1. So the Arabs, on the face of it, were, of course, much larger and stronger, or potentially stronger. But the truth is that, as in most wars, in this war too, the stronger side won. And the question is, what makes a society stronger in a war and other societies weaker? Well, the Jews knew how to mobilize. They were better organized and mobilized themselves, knowing that they would be attacked by the Arabs, because the Arabs kept saying, we're going to attack you. No, that's what they were doing. They were telling, on the radio, they were saying, if the UN passes partition resolution, we're going to invade. We're going to destroy you. That's what the radio station said. So the Jews, from the word go, from the beginning of Zionist settlement almost, organized themselves for war. They built trenches in the kibbutzim, peripheral lighting, barbed wire fences, small armories in each place. The Palestinians didn't organize for war. They didn't have bunkers against bombing or trenches and so on. And come the war, they were ill-prepared to withstand a Zionist assault. That's in terms of the Palestinians. The Palestinians may have had more guns than the Jews in 1947 on the eve of the war, but they had guns from Turkish times. But the main thing isn't that. The main thing is that they weren't organized nationally. They had 800 villages and towns. They had 800 militias. Each village had 20, 30, 100 guns, and it thought in terms of its own well-being. If we're attacked, our little militia will guard us. We're not going to start sending our troops and our young men with guns to go help Jaffa if Jaffa is attacked by the Jews. They didn't act nationally. They weren't organized nationally. The Jews were. They organized a national militia called the Haganah, which on the 1st of June 1948 simply changed its name to the IDF. It wasn't a new organization. It was the Haganah, which changed its name. The same brigades, the same commanders, the same divisions, and so on. The Jews were organized for war. The Jews also had the backing of world Jewry in terms of finance. There were also some volunteers, but they were mainly finance. They got between $100 and $150 million, mainly from American Jewry. And this financed the war-making. War-making is expensive. The Arab states, especially the ones who attacked Israel, were the frontline states, as they're called, were poor. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, they didn't have money. So even if they'd wanted to buy arms from abroad during the war, as the Jews did, and eventually managed to get the arms in, they weren't able to. They didn't know how to ship arms clandestinely against the UN embargo into Palestine, and they didn't know have the monetary wherewithal to buy these things. So as the war progressed, the Jewish army became much, much stronger, even in heavy weaponry, as opposed to the Arab side. One thing which is known, or at least is believed, that the Arab side at least had more manpower facing the Jewish manpower in the war, at least initially. Well, when the Arab states invaded on the 15th of May, they probably used about 20,000 troops. Altogether, Iraqis, Syrians, Jordanians, Egyptians, about 20,000 troops. The Haganah at that time had 30,000 men under arms on the 15th of May. So the Jews even outnumbered the combined Arab assault force on the 15th of May. Both sides then increased their forces. The Jews, by the end of the war, had 100,000 troops, slightly more than 100,000 troops, under arms. In other words, 1 in 7 of the population was in uniform in January 1949. The Arab states did add some more troops as the war progressed, but they ended up with something like 40 to 50,000 troops in the theater of war around Palestine, in Palestine. In other words, they were outnumbered that way. Now, the Arabs invading army, one last sentence, then I'll open for questions. The Arab armies, when they invaded on the 15th of May, did have heavy weaponry, and the Jews didn't. The Haganah did not have tanks, combat aircraft, proper artillery. They had mortars, but not proper artillery. And it took time for the things they had purchased abroad. The British were controlling Palestine until the 15th of May. The Haganah was an underground militia. The British wouldn't allow the Jews to bring in the heavy armaments. They were the sovereigns. They weren't going to have some underground force bringing in arms. From the 15th of May, the Jews had to hurry in the weaponry, the heavy weaponry they'd purchased mainly from Czechoslovakia, some of it from other places, and it was sort of a race against time to bring in the heavy weaponry with which they could counter the Arab heavy weaponry, which was in small numbers, but the Arab heavy weaponry which the Arab armies had deployed in Palestine. The Jews won the race, brought in the heavy weaponry, and by the end of the war, the Jewish army had much more heavy weaponry, and especially spare parts and ammunition for the heavy weaponry, than the Arab armies combined. Okay, that's just what I wanted to say about the war. Please, the thing is open for questions.
Do you have data on the number of Jews living in Palestine prior to the Zionist mission? What was their relationship with Palestine Arabs and Zionists?
There were about 25,000 Jews, 25 to 30,000 Jews in Palestine on the eve of the beginning, on the eve of the Zionist influx. In other words, before 1882, 25,000 Jews, alongside, incidentally, about 450,000 Arabs in Palestine at the time. These 25,000 Jews were 99% religious Jews, what we would call Haredim today, basically. Some of them Oriental, that is Middle Eastern extraction, some of them Eastern European extraction. The Oriental ones appeared to have had good neighborly relations and commercial relations with the Arabs of Palestine prior to the Zionist influx, even for some years after the beginning of Zionism. But from some point on, these relations sort of were severed because the Jews in Palestine, even the Orthodox, were identified by the Arabs as Jews, and therefore naturally supportive of the Zionist cause. So when, for example, in 1929, when one of these bouts of violence I mentioned originally, the Arabs assaulted the Jews in Palestine, 1929, August 1929, the Arabs in Hebron, attacked the Jewish community there, which was Haredi, and were not Zionists, they were anti-Zionist, but they killed 66 of them in a big pogrom in Hebron in August 1929, basically marking the end of the Jewish community in that town, which is one of the 4 holy sites of Judaism in Palestine. Jews, of course, after 67, after Israel conquered the West Bank, including Hebron, returned and resettled Hebron, and that's a major problem to this day, in my view. But the community was evicted, basically, in 29 by the Arab pogrom.
We're going to be able to have 2 more questions.
Okay.
This one just came in. What about the British? And then I can't quite read the rest.
Stern Gang killing
There you go.
It says Montgomery at the end. Somebody's got it wrong. The Stern Gang, there were 3 underground organizations in the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, during the 40s. There was the Haganah, which was the mainstream one, which was the large one, 30,000 members. And there were 2 small quasi-terrorist, quasi-national liberation organization groups. One was called the IZL, the Irgun Tzvai Leumi, which the British called the Irgun. And there was another one called the Stern Gang, which is what this guy's talking about, called the Lechi in Hebrew, Lochamei Cheirut Israel, the freedom fighters of Israel. And the Lechi in I think it was 44, assassinated the British minister resident in the Middle East, a man called Lord Moyne. I think that's what the person he is referring to. They never assassinated Montgomery, of course, was the commander of the 8th Army. But they assassinated Lord Moyne. This annoyed Churchill. Anyhow, but the British were stuck in an unenviable position between 2 inimical national groups, the Jews and the Arabs. And they ruled Palestine, and they couldn't rule it properly because the 2 sides were basically attacking each other over the years, over the decades. And the British in 1947 decided, we're going to get out of here. We can't solve the Jewish-Arab problem. We can't restore peace in Palestine, and decided to leave. Both sides, incidentally, afterwards, in the 48 war, thought that the British were supporting the other side. Because this has been the traditional, the Arab side always thought from 1917 on, the British are pro-Zionist and always support the Zionists. They didn't notice that the British in 1937, 38, 39, issuing the white paper, etc., had turned anti-Zionist, but the Arabs didn't notice that. And to this day, you ask an Arab about the British, they were anti-Zionist in 48, before 40, sorry, anti-Arab before 48, after 48. That's how, that's deep in their psyche. The same applies to the Jews in 48. The Jews in 48, taking note of what the British had done, changing a course in 1937-39, the Jews thought the British were, in 1948, solidly pro-Arab. But this wasn't really the case. The British tried to maintain impartiality in the war, certainly in the first half of the war when they were in Palestine. They were even neutral in the Partition resolution. They didn't vote for or against, they abstained. During the war, they tried to stay out of it, keep law and order, but stay out of the battles, not to support the Jews, not to support the Arabs. Some British officers favored the Arabs, some British officers favored the Jews. And so there was here and there a partiality, but as policy, they were impartial in the 48 war, the British. Yeah. This is the last question.
Will you tell us the future, please?
Tell us what?
The future.
Well, I know nothing about the future. I know something about the past. Thank you.
So much.
My pleasure. It's okay.
It was great.
Yeah. They've been
Thank you.